Ms. Larkin, you can continue with the defense closing argument.
I just have a few more points to make before I let you go, so I'm going to try not to take up more of your time. I know you guys have been very attentive, and we appreciate that. I just wanted to talk first about some of the characteristics that we observed on the victim Gabriel in this case. You saw the radio, you saw the binoculars, you saw the camouflage, you saw the photograph of Gabriel on a different occasion about 9 days prior to these events, wearing the same clothing, also carrying that radio, carrying binoculars, carrying a fanny pack. Could be the same fanny pack, could be different. But all of those things come together, and you heard testimony from Border Patrol who described what they perceive when they're observing somebody who's present in the United States illegally, carrying these sorts of accoutrements. And long story short, this is simply not somebody who's looking for the American dream. There's no evidence that this person is here for those kinds of benign purposes. All of the evidence, in fact, points in the other direction. And we bring that up not, to be judgmental about Gabriel or to not have compassion for him, but when people are involved in criminal lifestyle, it's dangerous. It's more inherently dangerous than simply being a migrant who's coming here. So it's relevant for that reason. I want to talk about what the state is actually asking you to believe, because they haven't really put everything together for you to tell you what happened in this case. And if we assume for a second that what the state is claiming here happened, then we have to try to fit that story into the known facts of this case. And that's always something we have to do. Consider the known facts of the case next to whatever's being presented to you to see if they make sense together. According to the state, Mr. Kelly is standing in his kitchen and he sees somehow out through those windows all the way out 115 yards to where Gabriel's body is eventually located. And he can somehow see that from inside his house. You all were there. I'll let you all be the judge of whether it's even possible to see somebody from inside the house. But let's say that he does. And let's say that he sees two unarmed people who are just moving somehow out there. The state wants you to believe that he calls law enforcement and makes up a story about hearing a shot and getting shot at, and he makes up a story about seeing people with backpacks. Then the state wants you to believe that after he makes that call to law enforcement, he picks up his rifle, he goes outside, he takes aim at these people who are posing absolutely no threat to him whatsoever, and he shoots because he just wants to kill somebody on his property. That's what the state wants you to believe happened. And then after that, if the state wants you to believe what Daniel says, they want you to believe that Mr. Kelly somehow crossed over those two fence lines and stood over Gabriel's body while Daniel was running away. They want you to believe that that's what happened. Just ask yourself, does that make sense? That's just the first part of this. Does that make any sense when you put it next to the physical evidence in this case and the known facts of this case? They want you to believe that after Mr. Kelly deliberately shoots this person and sees this person on the ground, that he then somehow manages to go over to the area where his barn is after calling and speaking with law enforcement again and telling them he saw people with guns. And then they want you to believe that he brings law enforcement onto his property, law enforcement searches his whole property, law enforcement doesn't find the body in this case, and then law enforcement leaves. If what the state is claiming happened actually happened, that would be the end of it. But that's not the end of it. The state wants you to believe that even after Allen knew he shot this person, did so deliberately, had no threat, no justification whatsoever to do it, called the cops, they left, he calls again because he thinks, you know, I really should just show them where this body is. They want you to believe that he decided a couple hours later to just bring law enforcement back onto his property and take them to the body. And they want you to believe that he did this without in any way trying to cover up any of his involvement in this, without picking up any shell casings, without getting rid of any weapon, and without concealing the body or doing anything like that. They want you to believe that the calm demeanor that they describe on the first call is his demeanor even after he's stood over this body and he knows he shot this person. He's calm. But somehow later when he's on the phone with dispatch, he's upset, he's distraught, he doesn't know what to do. I'm just asking you to consider whether any of that makes any sense when we look at the facts on the ground. And it does not. It makes absolutely no sense for this man, if he wanted to go out and shoot somebody, to call law enforcement right before he does it, speak to law enforcement right after he does it, right after he knows he did it, and then bring them back after he knows that they couldn't find the body because they didn't do a thorough enough search. None of that makes any sense when you look at the facts on the ground. What does make sense? Mr. Kelly sees a threat. He sees people with rifles. He calls law enforcement. He goes outside. He fires his warning shots exactly the way that he describes. He sees people moving from left to right. He turns in this direction to the right to fire over that tree that you all saw. Meanwhile, the body's discovered over there. It makes sense that Mr. Kelly did not fire any shots through that thicket in that direction. It makes sense that those shots were fired in the exact direction that he said that they were shot. And it makes sense that he continues to communicate with law enforcement. It makes sense that he's not distraught at this point. Why? Because he has no idea that there's a body there. In fact, we don't know that there is a body there when he calls law enforcement on that first call. It makes sense that he's telling law enforcement what happened and what he saw, and he's continuing to communicate. When he talks to the sheriff's department later, after he's discovered the body, it makes sense that he just discovered the body because of his demeanor in that phone call with the sheriff's department. He is upset and disturbed in a way that he was not earlier on in the day. All of the facts that we know make sense with Mr. Kelly's version of how things happened. They do not make sense with the state's version of how things happen. Nobody deliberately shoots a person right after calling law enforcement for help. And nobody, if they do that, which they don't, nobody lets law enforcement search their property, fail to discover the body, and then call them back later without taking any steps to conceal anything. Nobody does that. That makes absolutely no sense. Wanda Kelly probably picked the best word to describe that scenario, and that is crazy. Nobody does that. The standard in this case, we talked about this at the beginning, is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. This table has that burden. This table has no burden whatsoever. We do not carry any burden of proving to you that George Allen Kelly is not guilty. The state carries the entire burden proving to you that he is guilty. And I mean proof. And in order for you to find Allen guilty of any of these offenses, whether it's second-degree murder or any of the lesser included, manslaughter, negligent homicide, they have to prove to you that Allen shot this person. And they have not done that. The ballistics don't prove it. The witness statements don't prove it. Allen's own statements don't prove it. The facts on the ground do not prove it. They haven't done it. in order to prove the offense of aggravated assault against Daniel Ramirez, Daniel specifically, they have got to prove that Daniel was actually there. It's as simple as that. They cannot prove that Daniel was there. Anybody who is on Mr. Kelly's property, and you folks were all on Mr. Kelly's property, there is no chance that you could describe that property the way that Daniel described that property. This is not the house with the pine trees that is maybe west of Nogales, maybe east of Nogales, he changes. This is not the house where there's a border patrol road that goes directly to the end of the wall. This is not the house that's either 2 football fields away from the wall or 15 meters away from the wall. That is not a description that anybody could offer of this area who has been there. The only conclusion that can be reached based on Daniel's description of this property is that he wasn't there. And that's just the property. He describes other things too. He describes being 10 meters away from the house when this happens. There is no body that is 10 meters away from the house. That is not possible. He describes the house being on his left. I'm facing south. That puts him to the west. The body is located to the east. Again, not possible. Daniel describes the shots coming from away from the house, towards him and Gabriel. Not possible. You cannot find Mr. Kelly guilty of aggravated assault against Daniel because Daniel was not there. And you cannot find him guilty of any of the offenses, second-degree murder or lesser included, because they did not prove that Alan shot this person, and they have to prove it. Your jury instructions have various justifications. You're going to read about the defense of premises and what's required by law to allow somebody to defend their premises and what steps they can take to do so. You're going to read about self-defense, using physical force, using deadly physical force, and defense of third persons. All of those jury instructions describe what somebody can and what they cannot do when they're confronted with a threat. In this case, if Alan is telling the truth, and his is the only version that makes sense with the physical facts that we know and that we're not guessing about, he was confronted with a threat right outside of his home. That was a threat to his life. He had a rifle pointed at him. Under any scenario, he is absolutely justified in using deadly physical force to respond to that threat. He didn't use deadly physical force. He fired shots up into the air, over the tree, over where these people were, to get the threat to stop. And as soon as they turned and went the other way, he stopped firing. He didn't empty his magazine. The state's going to tell you that just firing warning shots is reckless, and just because he did that, you should find him guilty of something. That's not what the law says. The law does not say that you cannot use lesser force to defend yourself. The law does not say that when you're out in the middle of nowhere, and you folks were out there, this is not downtown Nogales, this is not a populated area, this is isolated, it is empty. He can fire warning shots to protect himself and to protect his wife. And that's exactly what he did. That's exactly what any man who cares about his wife and his home should do in this situation when faced with the threat that he was faced with. The jury instructions are going to explain to you that the state, besides having the burden of proving that Alan is guilty, they have that burden. They have the burden also of proving that Alan did not act with justification. It's up to them to prove it. It's not the defense's job to prove to you that Alan was justified in his actions. It's up to the state to prove that he was not. And we ask you to hold them to that burden. I told you at the beginning, this is a criminal case. The burden is serious. This is dead serious. And the reason that we have this serious burden of proof in a criminal case is because we really need to know before we hold somebody criminally accountable, before we go burn somebody at the stake. We have got to know that they are guilty. We can't just have suspicions. We cannot be guessing. We cannot hope that this happened because then maybe this does justice here. No, we have to absolutely know beyond a reasonable doubt that this man is guilty. That burden really requires that you folks are biased in favor of the defendant. If there are two possible interpretations of different pieces of evidence, the defendant gets the benefit of the doubt. That's how the system works. That is how we know you don't want to do something to the wrong person. Justice is not served if the wrong person is held accountable for somebody else's act. It's certainly not justice for Alan to hold the wrong person accountable, and it's not justice for Gabriel to hold the wrong person accountable for his death. Think of the burden of proof like scales. Scales balance like this. We start, the defendant is down here. He has the presumption of innocence. His scale has all of the weight. It is up to this table, it's up to the state to put weight into this other scale so that they're supposed to show you enough evidence that'll move it down, not so it's even, not so it's a little bit this way, but so their case is all the way on the floor and the defendant is now up here. That's the level of evidence that is required. And if they don't meet that, which they did not do in this case, then it's your job to find Mr. Kelly not guilty of these offenses. We want you to make this decision based on the facts, the known facts of the case, not based on subjective guesses about what somebody's words might mean, not based on, let's pick a small line in a transcript. Here, convict him based on this. No, that's not what this burden does. We are not permitted to just cherry pick somebody's words, decide what they mean subjectively, and convict a person because of that. You need facts. That's guessing, that's speculation. You can't guess or speculate. You need facts. And those facts have to be proven to you by this table. I wanted to remind you all again that we're not here to solve the mystery. If you sort through all the facts, you look at all of the evidence, you talk about it, and if you decide, I am not sure what happened here, we don't really know what happened here, that means the verdict must be not guilty. That is what that means. And the fact is, we're probably never going to know what really happened to Gabriel. And we won't know because the investigation in this case jumped to conclusions. They didn't search when they should have. They didn't preserve evidence that they should have. They didn't do tests that they should have. And now we'll never know. And when that's the case, when now we'll never know, that's a not guilty verdict. I just wanted to sort of leave you with what reasonable doubt is. It's not proof beyond any doubt whatsoever, but if you have real questions in your mind, if you're thinking, I just don't know, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, there's some evidence to suggest he did, there's some evidence to suggest maybe we're wrong about that, and then there are a lot of question marks and a lot of gaps over here that we don't know. The answer is a not guilty verdict. And if you're sitting back there in the jury room and you have those doubts, even if everybody else is all on board, if you have those doubts, then our system requires a not guilty verdict. We're asking you to have the courage to say no. Doesn't matter if there are any pitchforks or torches or anything involved. If there is doubt in your mind about whether Mr. Kelly did this, you have to have the courage to return a not guilty verdict, if there's any uncertainty at all. And they have to prove it. And I'll just leave this with, we talk about reasonable doubt a lot as lawyers. If there ever was a case where reasonable doubt existed, it is this case. If you put this case into an algorithm and asked a computer, does reasonable doubt exist? The answer is yes. We all live in Santa Cruz County. I live in Santa Cruz County, you folks live in Santa Cruz County, otherwise we wouldn't be here today. After reviewing all the evidence in this case, if I were to imagine finding a body on my property someday, hopefully that never happens. If I ever find a body on my property someday and I don't know what happened and I don't know how it got there, I think I'd be considering my options before I called these guys. Thank you for your time.